6 months after the incident aboard the Eternal Concordance, a new building rose on Earth Station Jericho, and representatives from 47 species gathered to witness something that would have seemed impossible just a year before. The Department of Practical Engineering was officially opening its doors, and for the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, humans would lead an institution dedicated to teaching the galaxy's most advanced civilizations how to fix things with their own hands. High Arbiter Su-Young Mira stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included Crystal Arch Ven, Master Circuit Weaver Thox, and dozens of other engineers who had once dismissed humanity as primitive newcomers to the galactic stage. When I first suggested contacting a human mechanic to help with our failing flagship, she began, I was met with ridicule and condescension. Our most brilliant engineers insisted that their advanced diagnostics would solve the problem, and they could not imagine that a species so new to space travel could offer anything of value. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience. They were wrong, and I am grateful that they were wrong, because their error taught us all something essential about the nature of progress. The chamber was silent as she continued. The Galactic Council has spent millennia developing technologies that seem miraculous. We have conquered distance and disease and want. We have built machines of incredible sophistication that operate for centuries without apparent maintenance. And in our success, we forgot something that humans never could forget. She gestured toward the window, where the new department building was visible against the backdrop of stars. Humans evolved on a harsh world where nothing was guaranteed. Their history is filled with scarcity and struggle and failure. And because of this, they developed a relationship with technology that we more fortunate species never understood. They expect things to break, and they plan for it. Crystal Arch Ven rose from his seat, his form glowing with colors that Myra now recognized as humility and respect. When I first met Park Junho, Ven said, his voice carrying harmonics of genuine emotion, I saw a primitive creature with crude tools who could not possibly understand our quantum systems. But I was looking at the surface instead of the substance. The truth is that human engineering represents a philosophy we had lost. He turned to address the full chamber. We built machines to be perfect because we feared imperfection. We hid failures instead of learning from them. We designed systems that lied to us rather than systems that told us uncomfortable truths. And we did all of this because we could not accept that even the most advanced technology will eventually fail. Humans build differently, Thox added. Rising to stand beside Ven, their machines announced their problems loudly. Their diagnostics are designed to show failures rather than hide them. Their entire approach assumes that something will go wrong and prepares for that moment. And this assumption, which we considered primitive, is actually the most sophisticated engineering principle in the galaxy. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. And when it faded, Mira made the announcement that everyone had been waiting for. The Department of Practical Engineering will be led by Yoon Hannah, she said, gesturing toward the young woman who stood at the side of the stage with quiet confidence. Her combination of systematic thinking and practical skill makes her ideal for building an institution that will bridge the gap between human methods and galactic technology. Hannah stepped forward and bowed to the assembled delegates. I accepted this position on one condition, she said, a voice calm and clear, that the department remain focused on teaching rather than doing. Our goal is not to become the mechanics for the entire galaxy, but to train engineers from every species to embrace practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. She glanced toward the back of the chamber, where Bei Dangu sat with a young Drathani at his side. Our first class of students has already begun training, Hannah continued, and within a year, they will return to their home worlds to teach others. The knowledge will spread, and eventually, every civilization in the Council will have engineers. who can look at a machine with their own eyes and fix it with their own hands. After the ceremony, Mira found Park Junho standing alone at an observation window, watching the ships come and go from the station's docking bays. "They offered you the position first," she said. Joining him at the window, "Hana told me you declined." "I am a mechanic," Junho replied simply. "I fix things. I do not run departments or give speeches or manage institutions. That is Hana's talent, not mine. So, what will you do now?" Junho smiled, the expression quiet and content. "There are still ships that need fixing," he said. "The Council fleet has centuries of hidden problems waiting to be discovered, and now that word has spread. Repair requests are coming from independent traders and colony worlds, and even a few species that are not part of the Council at all." He turned from the window and picked up his toolbox, which sat beside him as it always did. "Dongwu has taken on 6 apprentices from 4 different species," he continued. "Keth is already teaching her own students back on the Drathani homeworld, and more humans are arriving at Jericho every month to help with the growing demand. The galaxy needs mechanics," Myra said. And for the first time, the words carried respect instead of condescension. The galaxy always needed mechanics. Junho corrected gently. "It just forgot how to value them." He walked toward the docking bay where his battered shuttle waited, and Mira watched him go with a feeling of profound gratitude. 1 year later, the Galactic Council released its annual report on fleet operations, and the statistics told a story that would have seemed impossible before the incident on the Eternal Concordance. Critical system failures had decreased by 63% across all Council vessels. Repair response times had improved by over 80%, and the number of engineers trained in practical maintenance had grown from 3 humans to over 2,000 practitioners from dozens of species. But the most significant change was one that no statistics could capture throughout the fleet. Engineers who had once relied entirely on automated diagnostics now performed regular physical inspections of their systems. They listened to their machines and watched for warning signs that sensors could not detect. And they taught their students that the best technology was technology that could be understood, maintained, and repaired by the people who depended on it. On the anniversary of the department's founding, Dongwu led a ceremony in which his apprentices presented their first completed repairs to an audience of council dignitaries. Kath stood at the front of the group, holding a simple ventilation fan that she had restored using techniques that had seemed primitive to her just a year before. This fan was considered beyond repair by our most advanced diagnostic systems, she said, her voice steady with hard-won confidence, but with patience, careful observation, and proper tools. I was able to restore it to full function. She placed the fan on a display pedestal where it sat alongside artifacts from every species in the council. This is what the humans taught us, Kef continued. Not just how to fix machines, but how to approach problems with humility and persistence. How to trust our own senses alongside our instruments. And how to build relationships with the technology we depend on. Dongwu watched from the back of the room, his weathered face showing something that might have been pride, and beside him stood Junho, who had arrived that morning from another repair mission on the far side of the galaxy. You did good work, Junho said quietly. We all did, Dongwu replied. But the real work is just beginning. He was right, and across the galaxy, in engine rooms and maintenance bays and repair shops on 1,000 worlds, the next generation of practical engineers was learning to listen to machines the way humans always had. The Galactic Council's embarrassment had become its greatest lesson, and the lesson would echo through the stars for generations to come, not because humans were superior, but because they had never forgotten that even the most advanced technology was ultimately just a tool, and tools worked best when someone cared enough to maintain them. The first time Bei Dongwu kicked a malfunctioning pump, Three Valnoxi engineers nearly fainted from shock, and Crystal Arch Ven made a sound that might have been a scream translated through crystal harmonics. "What are you doing?" Ven demanded, his form blazing with alarm. "That is precision equipment worth more than your entire space station." Dongwu kicked the pump again, harder this time, and the machine shuddered once before resuming normal operation with a healthy hum that it had not produced in decades. "Percussive maintenance," the old mechanic explained with obvious satisfaction. "Sometimes components get stuck or misaligned, and a sharp impact can reset them to proper position. That is not a recognized engineering technique," one of the Drethani engineers protested, her compound eyes wide with disbelief. "It is recognized by every human who has ever fixed a machine," Dongwu replied, already moving on to the next system on his inspection list. "Your problem is that you think engineering is about elegance and theory. But real engineering is about making things work, no matter what it takes." Over the following week, the three humans moved through the eternal concordance like a force of nature, and the alien engineers who followed them experienced something between horror and revelation. Yoon Hana worked with cold precision, mapping every diagnostic pathway and identifying the blind spots where the ship's sensors could not see. And she documented 17 critical systems that had been slowly failing for years without triggering a single alarm. "Your atmospheric processors are operating at 60% efficiency," she reported to a gathering of senior engineers, her tablet displaying charts and diagrams that contradicted the perfect readings on their own screens. "The filters have not been physically replaced in over 40 years, because your diagnostics measure air quality output rather than filter condition. So the system keeps working harder to produce the same results, while consuming more power and generating more heat. The filters are rated to last indefinitely," a Morvathi engineer objected, her scales rippling with defensive patterns. "Nothing lasts indefinitely," Hana replied. "Your filters are degrading at a molecular level in ways that your sensors cannot detect. And in approximately 3 years, they will fail completely, and your atmospheric system will stop working within hours." The Marvathi had no response to that. Meanwhile, Junho worked methodically through the engine systems, replacing components that the diagnostics swore were functioning perfectly. And each replacement brought visible improvements in power efficiency and response time. "Your engines are running 20% better than before," Crystal Arch Ven admitted reluctantly after watching Junho work for several days. "But I do not understand how that is possible when nothing was wrong according to our instruments." "Your instruments measure outputs," Junho explained patiently. "They check if the engine produces the expected power and responds within acceptable parameters. But they do not measure how hard the engine is working to achieve those outputs. So an engine running at 50% efficiency looks the same to your sensors as one running at 90% efficiency. Why would we build sensors that cannot detect efficiency problems? Because your engineers assumed the engines would always operate at peak efficiency," Junho said. "You designed for perfection instead of reality." But it was Dongwu who provided the most dramatic education. The old mechanic had taken a particular interest in a young Drethani engineer named Keth, who had followed him everywhere for days with an expression of fascinated confusion. "You want to learn?" Dongwu asked her one morning, holding out a heavy metal wrench. "I have completed advanced training in quantum mechanics and probability engineering," Keth replied, her forearms flexing nervously. "I do not know what I could learn from physical tools. You can learn to actually fix things," Dongwu said bluntly. "All your fancy training taught you how to understand machines, but it never taught you how to help them when they are hurting." He pressed the wrench into one of her hands and led her to a ventilation shaft that had been making an intermittent grinding noise. "For the past century, your diagnostics probably say this is normal. Operational variance," Dongwu said. But listen to that sound. Really listen. What do you hear? Kath pressed her sensory organs against the shaft and concentrated for a long moment. It sounds like friction, she said slowly. Something rubbing against something else inside the mechanism. Good. Now what could cause that? Kath thought about it, her compound eyes flickering as she processed the question. A bearing could be worn or damaged, she said. Or perhaps debris caught in the fan assembly. Or a mounting bracket that has come loose over time. So how do we find out which one? We could run a diagnostic scan to measure vibration patterns and compare them against known failure modes. Kath began. But Dongwu was already shaking his head. That will tell you what the problem looks like, he said. But it will not tell you what the problem is. The only way to know for certain is to open it up and look, he guided Kath through the process of accessing the ventilation mechanism, showing her how to remove panels and disconnect power safely. And when they finally exposed the interior, they found exactly what Kath had suspected. A mounting bracket had loosened over decades of operation, allowing the fan to wobble slightly with each rotation. And the wobble had worn a groove in the housing that would eventually cause catastrophic failure. Your diagnostics would have detected this eventually, Donghu said as Kath carefully tightened the bracket and inspected the worn housing. Probably about 10 minutes before the whole system exploded. But now you have fixed it before that could happen. How did you know what to listen for? Kath asked, her voice filled with genuine wonder. Experience, Dongwu replied. I have listened to thousands of machines in my life, and I have learned that every machine has a voice. A healthy machine sounds different from a sick one, and if you pay attention, the machine will tell you what it needs. Kath looked down at the wrench in her hand, and then back at the ventilation system she had just repaired with her own effort. Could you teach me more? She asked. Dongwu smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. That is the first smart thing I have heard an alien engineer say since we arrived, he replied. Yes, I will teach you, and you will teach the others. Because the galaxy needs more engineers who know how to actually fix things by the end of the week. The Eternal Concordance was running better than it had in decades. And a small group of alien engineers had begun learning the fundamentals of practical repair work. Word of the humans. Success had spread to other council vessels, and requests for assistance were flooding in from across the fleet. Crystal Arch Ven watched his junior engineers, practicing with physical tools under Dongwu's supervision. And for the first time since the humans had arrived, his form glowed with something other than embarrassment. I believe I owe you an apology, he said to Junho, who was packing up his equipment for departure. I dismissed your methods as primitive because I did not understand them. But I see now that there is wisdom in your approach that our advanced technology forgot. Junho clasped the Crystal Arch's appendage in the closest approximation of a handshake that they're different. Anatomies allowed. Every civilization makes the same mistake eventually, he said. You become so focused on building perfect machines that you forget machines exist to serve people. Not the other way around. How do we avoid making that mistake again? Junho smiled and gestured toward Kath, who was showing another young engineer how to properly hold a diagnostic probe. You teach the next generation to remember that technology is a tool, he said, and tools are only useful if someone knows how to use them. 3 days after Park Junho saved the Eternal Concordance from disaster, the diplomatic summit resumed as if nothing had happened, and the Galactic Council seemed determined to forget the embarrassment as quickly as possible. Crystal Arch Ven had thanked the human mechanic politely, but firmly declined his offer to inspect the ship further, and the alien engineers had returned to their quantum sensors and probability matrices with renewed dedication to proving that advanced technology needed no primitive assistance. Junho had returned to his shuttle with a payment that was generous, but clearly meant to encourage his departure. And High Arbiter Mira had watched him go with a feeling that something important had been left unfinished. He warned us about other problems, she said to Ven before the flagship departed for its next destination. Perhaps we should at least consider his concerns. The diagnostic systems are now functioning at full capacity, Ven replied, his crystalline form radiating confidence that bordered on arrogance. We have run complete scans of every system and found nothing wrong. The human was useful for his crude observation skills. But our technology is more than capable of handling any future issues. Myra wanted to argue, but diplomatic duties called her away. And the summit continued for another 2 days of negotiations and ceremonies and formal dinners that required all of her attention. On the third night, she was awakened by alarms. The water recycling system had failed catastrophically, and contaminated liquid was flooding 3 decks. And the pumps that should have handled the emergency were not responding. And once again, the diagnostic system showed nothing wrong. Mira ran to the engineering deck in her sleeping clothes and found chaos waiting for her. Engineers from 6 species shouted at each other in a dozen languages. Holographic displays showed green indicators that contradicted the obvious disaster unfolding around them. And Christoarch Ven stood in the center of it all, with his form flickering in patterns that suggested something very close to panic. The sensors show optimal function, one Drathani engineer kept repeating, her compound eyes wide with disbelief. The pumps are operating at normal capacity, the recycling filters are clean. There is no explanation for what we are seeing. People are drowning in contaminated water 3 decks below us. Thok snapped back. And you are telling me your sensors say everything is fine? Myra pushed through the crowd until she reached Ven. And she did not bother to hide her anger. You were warned, she said, a voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The human mechanic told you there were more problems. And you dismissed him because his methods were primitive. His warnings were vague and unsupported by any data. Ven protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Our scans found nothing wrong. Your scans are worthless, Myra replied. And the engineering deck fell silent at her words. I am invoking emergency diplomatic authority again. And this time, you will not argue with me. She turned to the communications officer who had followed her from her quarters. Contact Earth Station Jericho immediately, she ordered. Tell Park Junho that we need him back. And tell him to bring his full crew this time. The human shuttle arrived 6 hours later. And this time, 3 figures emerged from the airlock. Instead of one, Park Junho led the way, his toolbox heavier than before. And behind him came a young woman with sharp eyes and a tablet computer tucked under her arm. And an older man with gray hair and hands that looked like they had fixed every machine ever built. This is Yoon Hana, my apprentice, Junho said, nodding toward the young woman, and Bei Dongwu, who has been fixing ships longer than most of you have been alive. Dongwu looked around the elegant corridor and snorted with obvious contempt. Pretty, he said, his voice rough and unimpressed. I bet it breaks constantly. The ship was built to never require repair, Ven said, appearing behind Mira with several of his engineers. We did not anticipate primitive mechanical failures. Dongwu laughed, a harsh sound that made several aliens flinch. Every machine breaks, he said. The only question is whether you build it so you can fix it when it does, or whether you pretend it will last forever and then panic when reality proves you wrong. Junho placed a calming hand on his colleague's shoulder and addressed Christoarch Ven directly. The water recycling system uses the same diagnostic architecture as the engines, he said, which means your sensors are lying to you again. Probably because of a similar failure in a component they are not designed to monitor. Then what do you suggest? Ven asked, and Mira was surprised to hear genuine uncertainty in his voice instead of pride. Let us do what we do. Junho replied. Hannah will map your ship's systems and find the blind spots in your diagnostics. Dongwu will inspect the physical infrastructure and find the failures your sensors are missing. And I will fix what we find. And what should we do? Thox asked, stepping forward with her forearms crossed in a gesture that might have been defensive or curious. Hannah looked up from her tablet and spoke for the first time. Her voice calm and precise. Watch and learn, she said, because after we leave, you will need to be able to do this yourselves. Over the next 6 hours, the 3 humans moved through the ship like a coordinated team, and the alien engineers who followed them saw their vessel in an entirely new way. Dongwu found the water system failure in 20 minutes, a mechanical seal that had degraded, because the synthetic lubricant used in its construction had broken down over decades of operation. Your sensors measure water flow and chemical composition, he explained to the group of Drithani who watched him work. But they do not measure the physical condition of the seals. So when this one started leaking, your system compensated by increasing pump pressure, which damaged the pumps, which caused more leaks, which required more pressure, until everything failed at once. Why did our diagnostics not detect the increasing pressure? One Drithani asked. Because your system is designed to maintain optimal readings, Hannah answered from across the room, where she was tracing data pathways on her tablet. When something goes wrong, your computers adjust other systems to hide the problem instead of reporting it. So the readings always look perfect even as the actual machine falls apart. Crystal Arch then listened to this explanation with his form cycling through colors that suggested deep discomfort. We designed the system to be self-correcting, he said slowly. We thought that was an advantage. It is an advantage when the problems are small, Junho replied, replacing the degraded seal with a new one that Dongwu had fabricated from materials in their shuttle. But your system treats every problem as small. It hides everything instead of distinguishing between minor issues and critical failures. So you never know when something serious is happening until it is too late. Human machines are different? Dox asked. Junho smiled slightly as he finished his repairs. Human machines break loudly, he said. They make strange sounds and leak fluids and flash warning lights that cannot be ignored. And we build them that way on purpose, because we know that hidden failures are more dangerous than obvious ones. Dongwu patted the repaired pump with something like affection. A good machine tells you when it is hurting, he added. So you can help it before it dies. The water system returned to function, and the crisis was averted, but this time, no one suggested that the humans should leave. Instead, High Arbiter Mira called an emergency session of the senior delegates and proposed something that would have been unthinkable 3 days earlier. I recommend that we hire Park Junho and his team for a complete inspection of this vessel, she said, and that we distribute their findings to every ship in the Council fleet. The debate that followed was fierce, but shorter than she expected, and when the vote was taken, the motion passed by a wide margin. The Galactic Council had finally admitted that they needed human mechanics, and the real education was about to begin. Park Junho followed the Kavathi diplomat through corridors that probably cost more than his entire space station, and he noticed immediately that the ship was too quiet in all the wrong ways. The Eternal Concordance was beautiful in the way that expensive things often were. All smooth surfaces and hidden machinery and elegant design that prioritized appearance over accessibility. And Junho had seen enough such vessels to know that beauty often hid serious problems. The engineering deck is this way, High Arbiter Mira said, glancing back at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Crystal Arch Ven is expecting you, though I should warn you that he is not pleased about your presence. Most people are not pleased to see a mechanic, Junho replied calmly. Until they need one. They entered the engineering deck. And Junho found himself facing a wall of skeptical alien faces, each one radiating doubt and condescension in their own species-specific way. Crystal Arch Ven stepped forward, his body pulsing with colors that Junho did not need to understand to recognize as hostile. And the alien engineer looked down at the human with obvious disdain. "So you are the primitive mechanic that High Arbiter Myra has summoned against my recommendation," Ven said, his voice carrying harmonics of barely concealed insult. "Tell me, human, have you ever even seen a quantum lattice propulsion system before today?" "I have seen many engines," Junho answered, setting down his toolbox with a heavy clang that made several engineers flinch. "And I have fixed most of them. This is not some crude chemical rocket or primitive fusion drive," Ven continued, gesturing at the holographic display behind him. "The Eternal Concordance operates on principles that human science will not discover for another millennium at least." Junho walked past the crystal arch without responding, approaching the engine room access hatch, and the alien engineers parted before him with expressions of disbelief at his audacity. "The diagnostic systems show nothing wrong," one of the Drethani engineers called out, her tone suggesting that this fact alone should send the human away in defeat. "Every reading is within optimal parameters." Junho paused at the hatch and turned back to face the room full of the galaxy's greatest engineers. "When did you last look at the engines with your own eyes?" he asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. "The quantum lattice system cannot be visually inspected," Ven explained with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a very slow child. "The energies involved would destroy organic matter instantly. So we monitor everything through sensor arrays that are far more accurate than biological senses. And those sensors tell you nothing is wrong." "Correct. Yet the engines do not work." Ven's light patterns flickered with irritation. "We are aware of the contradiction, human. We have been working on this problem for 2 days." Junho nodded slowly, then opened his toolbox and pulled out a simple wrench, a flashlight, and a device that looked like it might be some kind of listening instrument. The Drethani engineer named Thox leaned toward Mira and whispered, "Are those his tools?" With such horror in her voice that it was almost funny, Junho opened the maintenance panel that the alien engineers had apparently never noticed, and he shined his flashlight into the darkness beyond. And then he did something that made every engineer in the room stare in complete confusion. He began tapping on pipes with his wrench, listening carefully to the sounds they made. "What is he doing?" Ven demanded, his form blazing with bewildered light. "I do not know," Myra admitted. Watching the human work with fascination, Junho moved methodically through the maintenance corridors, tapping and listening, sometimes pressing his ear directly against metal surfaces, sometimes running his fingers along wiring with his eyes closed. And the alien engineers followed him at a distance like confused children watching an adult perform some incomprehensible ritual. After nearly an hour of this strange investigation, Junho stopped before a junction box buried deep in the ship's infrastructure, and he sniffed the air several times before opening the panel. "Found it," he said simply. The engineers crowded around him, their instruments ready, their sensors activated, and they all stared at what Junho's flashlight revealed: a small creature, something like a rodent but with 6 legs and bioluminescent spots, had chewed through a single power coupling, and its tiny body lay curled in the corner of the junction box, dead from the electrical discharge that had killed it. "That is the problem?" Thox asked, her voice rising with disbelief. "A pest chewed through a wire?" "This wire connects your backup power distribution to your main diagnostic array," Junho explained, pulling out the damaged coupling and examining it closely. "When it failed, your diagnostics lost the ability to detect problems in about 30% of your ship's systems, including the primary engine controller." Crystal Arch Ven pushed forward, his form now pulsing with agitated colors. That is impossible. The backup power systems have their own monitors. Any failure would have been detected immediately. Your monitors check if power is flowing, Junho said. They do not check if the monitoring systems themselves are receiving accurate information. So when this coupling failed, your diagnostics started lying to you, and you had no way to know. He reached deeper into the junction box and pulled out a second damaged component. This one, clearly the primary engine controller that Ven had insisted could not possibly be broken. The controller has a burnt connector, Junho continued, showing them the obvious scorch marks that their sensors had somehow missed, probably from a power surge when the pest caused the short circuit. Replace this component and restore the coupling, and your ship will fly again. The engineering deck was absolutely silent as the implications sank in 2 days of panic and terror. 47 delegations facing death, the greatest engineers in the galaxy, working around the clock. And the problem was a single burnt connector and a chewed wire that any apprentice mechanic could have found in an hour. The diagnostic systems should have detected this, Ven said, his voice barely above a whisper, his form now dim with what could only be described as profound embarrassment. Your diagnostic systems are designed to detect quantum irregularities and energy fluctuations and probability cascades. Junho replied, already pulling replacement parts from his toolbox. But no one programmed them to check for burned connectors or chewed wires because your engineers apparently assumed such primitive failures could never happen on such an advanced ship. He began the repairs with quick, practiced movements. And within 20 minutes, the lights in the engineering deck flickered and then blazed to full brightness. And a cheer echoed through the ship as power returned to every system high. Arbiter Myra watched Crystal Arch Ven and his fellow engineers stare at the human mechanic with expressions that shifted from embarrassment to something that might have been the beginning of respect. Your ship should fly now, Junho said, packing up his tools. But I found 17 other problems during my inspection. Small things that will become big things soon. And your diagnostic systems will not see them because they are not looking for simple failures. Ven's form flickered with conflicting colors, pride warring with the undeniable evidence before him. Perhaps, the Crystal Arch said slowly, as if each word caused him physical pain. You could show us what you found. Junho looked at the alien engineer for a long moment, and then he smiled slightly and set his toolbox back down. That will take longer, he said, and I will need my crew. The massive flagship of the Galactic Council drifted silently through the darkness of space, and for the first time in 300 years, its engines made no sound at all. The Eternal Concordance was the pride of 12 civilizations, a vessel so advanced that its creators claimed it would never require repair. And now it floated dead in the void while 47 diplomatic delegations waited inside with growing panic. High Arbiter Su Yong, Myra of the Korvathi, stood at the observation deck and watched the stars spin slowly as the ship lost its stabilization. And she felt a cold dread settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the failing temperature controls. How long until life support reserves are depleted? She asked the junior officer beside her. Approximately 6 standard days. High Arbiter, the young Korvathi replied, his silver scales flickering with nervous patterns. But the Velnoxy engineers assure us they will solve the problem before then. Mira had heard such assurances for the past 2 days, and each time she heard them, she believed them less. She walked through the darkened corridors of the flagship, past delegates from dozens of worlds who huddled together and whispered their fears. And she made her way to the engineering deck where the greatest minds in the galaxy had gathered to solve an impossible puzzle. The scene she found there would have been comical if the situation were not so desperate. Crystal Arch Ven the chief engineer of the Volnoxy Quantum Course, stood before a massive holographic display that showed the ship's systems in perfect working order, and beside him, 17 other engineers from 8 different species stared at their own instruments with expressions of complete confusion. The readings showed nothing wrong, Ven declared for what must have been the 100th time, his crystalline body pulsing with frustrated light. Every quantum pathway is aligned, every power matrix is stable, and every circuit shows optimal function. And yet, Myra said as she approached, the ship does not move, the lights do not shine, and we drift toward death in the cold of space. Ven turned his faceted head toward her, and the patterns in his body shifted to a shade that Myra recognized as embarrassment, mixed with irritation. High Arbiter. Engineering is not a matter for diplomats to understand, he said with barely concealed condescension. The diagnostic systems are the most advanced in the galaxy, and if they show nothing wrong, then logically nothing is wrong. Then why are we dying? Asked the Rathani Master Circuit Weaver Thox, who had been silent until now. Her forearms crossed over her thorax in a gesture of deep frustration. My own instruments confirm the Crystal Arch's readings, and yet reality contradicts us all. The engineering deck fell into uncomfortable silence, and Mira looked around at the greatest technical minds of the Galactic Council, each one helpless before a problem their perfect machines could not even identify. She thought of a conversation she had overheard 3 months ago on a trading station near the human colony world, and she hesitated before speaking because she knew how her next words would be received. There is a human repair station approximately 4 hours from our current position, she said carefully. Watching the reactions around her, the silence that followed was worse than she expected. Crystal Arch. Ven's body flashed with colors of pure offense, and several of the Drathani engineers made clicking sounds of disbelief. And even the usually stoic Morvathi delegation representative let out a long hiss of dismissal. Humans. Ven said the word as if it were an insult. The species that has been spacefaring for barely 2 centuries. The primitives who still use physical tools and chemical propulsion. The creatures who build machines that break and consider it normal. I merely suggest an alternative perspective, Myra replied, keeping her voice steady despite her irritation. When the conventional approach fails repeatedly, perhaps unconventional assistance might prove valuable. The Volnoxy built this ship, Ven declared, his light patterns now blazing with wounded pride. We have constructed vessels that cross galaxies without maintenance for 1,000 years. And you suggest we ask primitives for help because of one minor malfunction. Minor malfunction? Thox interrupted, her compound eyes glittering with anger. We've been drifting for 2 days. Life support will fail in less than a week. And 47 diplomatic delegations may die in this floating tomb you call a minor malfunction. The argument that followed was fierce and complicated, with species loyalty mixing with genuine technical disagreement. And Mira watched it all with growing despair. She slipped away from the engineering deck and made her way to the communication center, where a skeleton crew maintained the few systems that still functioned on backup power. Can you establish a connection to the nearest human station? She asked the communications officer, a young Velnoxy whose crystal form was dim with exhaustion. I can attempt it, High Arbiter. But such communication would require authorization from the Crystal Arch. Myra considered her options for a long moment, and then she made a decision that would either save the Council or end her career. I am invoking emergency diplomatic authority under Article 7 of the Galactic Charter, she said. The safety of 47 delegations supersedes normal command structure, and I am ordering you to contact the human station immediately. The officer hesitated, his form flickering with uncertainty, but finally he turned to his console and began the transmission sequence. 4 hours later, a small shuttle emerged from hyperspace near the drifting flagship. And the delegates who watched from the observation decks felt their hope mixed with deep skepticism. The human vessel was small and battered, its hull covered with visible repair patches and scorch marks from what appeared to be decades of hard use. And it approached the gleaming eternal concordance like a wounded animal approaching a sleeping giant. "That is their repair ship?" one Drathani delegate asked with obvious horror. "It appears to be held together with faith and desperation. Perhaps they intend to frighten our engines back into function," another delegate joked. But no one laughed. High Arbiter Myra watched the shuttle dock with the flagship, and she felt the weight of her decision pressing down upon her, knowing that if this human mechanic failed, she would bear the blame for the Council's humiliation, and if he succeeded, the Council would face an even more uncomfortable truth. She walked to the docking bay to meet their unlikely savior, and she wondered if the Galactic Council was ready to learn that sometimes the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy needed help from the species they had dismissed as primitives. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and a single human stepped through, carrying a metal box of tools that looked older than most Velnoxy buildings. He was not tall or impressive or intimidating in any way that the Council species would recognize. Just a middle-aged human with calloused hands and patient eyes, and a quiet confidence that came from years of solving problems that others could not. "I am Park Jun-ho," he said simply, looking around at the magnificent corridor that surrounded him with complete disinterest. "I hear you have engine trouble." And with those words, the Galactic Council's education in humility began.